My mother-in-law is manipulative and passive-aggressive. The first time I truly felt the weight of my mother-in-law's presence was shortly after my wedding. My husband and I had been together for a few years before deciding to marry. We had faced our fair share of challenges, but we had always gotten through them, united and stronger for it. However, nothing quite prepared me for the subtle, insidious dynamics that would unfold once we were officially married and my relationship with his family began to evolve. In the beginning, she seemed charming, welcoming, kind, and keen to build a good relationship with me. My husband's family was close-knit, and they expected to be involved in every aspect of his life. At first, I was eager to embrace this, thinking that this was how families should be. But it didn't take long to see that her warmth was a mask, a carefully crafted façade that hid something darker beneath. Over time, I began to notice little things that gnawed at me. It started with the passive-aggressive comments. At family dinners, my mother-in-law would casually mention how unfortunate it was that I didn't cook as well as she did, or how it must be hard for my husband to adjust to having someone else take care of him. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just her way of making conversation. But after a while, I realized that there was always a pointed edge to her words, something meant to undermine me, to make me feel inadequate in a way that was too subtle to call out. She never said anything outright, never yelled or confronted me in a way that would give me a clear reason to stand my ground. Instead, she used sarcasm and backhanded compliments to get under my skin. When I dressed up for a family gathering, she would comment on how nice it was that I was trying so hard to fit in. If I made a choice that differed from her preferred way of doing things, she would feign confusion, asking, "Are you sure that's what you want to do? It's just that we've always done it this way." And yet, every time I tried to assert my own preferences, her passive resistance became more pronounced. It wasn't just her words either, it was the way she acted. She would often show up at our house uninvited, with no prior warning. At first, I felt flattered, thinking she was just eager to spend time with us. But it became clear that she expected us to drop whatever we were doing to cater to her. If I had plans, she would insist that we cancel them, offering a forced "Oh, I just thought you might want to spend time with me." It was always under the guise of being helpful, but it felt more like an invasion, a way to disrupt our lives and assert control. My husband, despite being loving and supportive, had grown used to his mother's behavior over the years. He didn't see it the way I did. He didn't recognize how she subtly manipulated every situation, how her guilt trips would quietly erode my confidence. When I tried to talk to him about it, he would brush it off, suggesting that I was overthinking things or being too sensitive. "She's just trying to help, babe," he would say, but his words never gave me the validation I needed. Every time I voiced my discomfort, he would assure me it was nothing more than her way of showing love, as though I was the one in the wrong for feeling uneasy about it. As the months passed, I started to feel like I was constantly walking on eggshells around her. Every interaction was fraught with an underlying tension, and I began dreading family gatherings. My mother-in-law had this way of making everything seem like a favor, but at the same time, she would subtly remind me that nothing was ever good enough. If I thanked her for something, she would smile sweetly, but I could tell it wasn't genuine. It was as though she was counting how much I owed her, keeping track of every little thing. There was always a sense of debt in our interactions, and it made me feel small, insignificant. At the same time, I could never escape her. She was a constant presence, always in our lives, always orchestrating things behind the scenes. I'd find messages from her on my husband's phone, telling him how much she missed him, how she was worried about me taking him away from her. It was manipulative in the most covert way, making him feel guilty for having a life outside of her. She would often make comments about how lucky I was to have such a great husband, yet her tone always suggested that I didn't deserve him the way she did. It was as if she was trying to rewrite the narrative, to make herself the central figure in our relationship, to imply that her role in his life should never be questioned. It became clear that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. If I tried to please her, I'd only find myself bending to her will, losing a little more of myself in the process. If I set a boundary, she would make sure to overstep it, testing me until I cracked. And when I did win, I finally broke down in frustration, feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. She would feign innocence, claiming that she never meant to hurt me. It was always my fault for misinterpreting her actions, for not understanding that she only wanted what was best for me, for us. The worst part was that I had no one to turn to. My husband didn't see what I saw, and his reluctance to confront his mother only left me feeling isolated. I began to feel like an outsider in my own marriage, a stranger in my own home. No matter how many times I tried to explain the emotional toll it was taking on me, it never seemed to land. It felt like I was speaking a foreign language, one that no one understood. Eventually, I found myself retreating more and more into myself. I stopped fighting her, stopped confronting the subtle jabs, and instead, I started to quietly distance myself. I kept my head down, avoiding her as much as possible, hoping that time would somehow make things better. But it didn't. With each passing day, I could feel the erosion of my self-esteem, the way her words and actions chipped away at my sense of self-worth. I wanted to believe that things would change. I wanted to believe that she would recognize the harm she was causing and stop manipulating my relationship with my husband. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. She was too entrenched in her ways, too comfortable in her role as the woman who controlled everything around her. Had to accept that the power dynamics in our relationship had shifted, and I was the one who had to decide whether or not I was willing to keep allowing myself to be drawn into her web. The more I tried to navigate her manipulations, the more I realized that the real battle wasn't just with her, it was with myself. It was about whether or not I could find the courage to stand up for myself, to take back the control that had been slowly stripped away. I had to decide if I was willing to keep sacrificing my peace for the sake of someone who would never be satisfied. It wasn't an easy decision, and it didn't come quickly. But with time, I began to find the strength to set boundaries, real, firm boundaries. I learned that I didn't have to engage with her passive-aggressive behavior, that I didn't have to accept her manipulation just because it was her way. Slowly but surely, I began to take back control over my own life, my own happiness. I knew that this would continue to be a difficult road, that the dynamic with my mother-in-law would never be what I had hoped it would be. But I also knew that the longer I allowed her to dictate the terms of our relationship, the more I would lose myself, and I was finally ready to stop losing. As time went on, the weight of my mother-in-law's influence began to feel lighter, but it was still present, lingering like a shadow. I was no longer consumed by the constant emotional strain that she used to impose on me, but there were moments, small, subtle moments, when her manipulations would creep back in. It was as though she had learned how to play the long game, how to wait for the right opportunity to reassert her control over me. But now, I was more aware. The more I distanced myself emotionally, the more her tactics seemed desperate, even pathetic at times, but I had learned to keep my distance. It wasn't just her words or actions anymore that caused me to feel uneasy, it was her expectations. She would still show up at our house unannounced, her presence overwhelming, expecting us to drop everything and cater to her needs. At first, I would try to accommodate her out of guilt, not wanting to upset my husband, but the more I allowed myself to be manipulated, the more I realized it wasn't just hurting me, it was hurting our relationship. My husband started noticing the tension that was building between us, even if he didn't quite understand the full extent of it. One night, after one of her uninvited visits, my husband and I sat down on the couch in silence. It wasn't the first time we'd had moments like this, but this one felt different. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unsaid words. I could feel the distance growing between us, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to open up fully about the damage it was doing to me. I had tried before, and each time, it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. He didn't see what I saw in his mother. He couldn't, because he had been conditioned to accept it as normal, as something that was just part of family dynamics. But tonight, I was done. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I had spent years absorbing the hurt in silence, but I could feel my own soul withering under the strain of it all. The passive-aggressive comments, the guilt trips, the silent judgment, they had eaten away at my self-esteem, chipped at my sense of worth until I barely recognized the person I had become. I was becoming someone I didn't like. Someone who had let another person's emotional manipulation dictate the terms of her own happiness. I knew my husband loved me, but I also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The longer I stayed silent, the more my resentment grew. It wasn't just about his mother anymore, it was about us. It was about how I had allowed her behavior to drive a wedge between us, and how my own inability to set boundaries had weakened our relationship. If we were ever going to move forward, I had to address the elephant in the room head-on, without any more fear of rocking the boat. The next time we spoke about his mother, it wasn't gentle. I didn't hold back, nor did I censor myself. I spoke about how it felt to always be undermined, how the constant subtle digs eroded my confidence, how I could feel the manipulation in every interaction. I talked about how every time she pushed my boundaries, every time she inserted herself into our space, I felt smaller, more invisible, like I was losing my voice, and I told him that the only way I could stay in this marriage, the only way we could have a future together, was if we confronted the toxic behavior head-on and set firm boundaries together. It wasn't easy for him to hear. He had always been caught in the middle, torn between his loyalty to me and his deep-rooted sense of obligation to his mother. I could see the pain in his eyes, the conflict between wanting to protect me and not wanting to alienate his mother, but this time, there was something different in the way I spoke. There was an urgency, a rawness, a desperation that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just about defending myself anymore, it was about saving us, saving our marriage, from the weight of the unresolved tension. I wasn't just angry at her, I was angry at myself for allowing this to go on for so long without taking a stand. The days that followed weren't easy. There were more conversations, more tears, more uncomfortable silences as we navigated the path of setting boundaries with his mother, but there was also progress, slow but steady. My husband began to see things from my perspective, began to understand how the dynamic with his mother had seeped into our relationship and created a rift between us. He started to recognize the passive-aggressive behavior for what it was, not as his mother's way of helping, but as manipulation disguised as care. For the first time, we talked about the difficult reality of standing up to his mother, of telling her no when she overstepped, of making it clear that our marriage and our home needed to be respected. It wasn't easy for him to assert himself in this way, to confront his mother about her behavior. He had spent so many years placating her, not wanting to rock the boat, that it was hard for him to accept that change was necessary, but he understood. Slowly, he began to take more ownership of the situation, not as a way to defend me, but as a way to protect what we had built together. We started to make small but significant changes. His mother no longer had free rein to show up uninvited, to expect us to cater to her whims without consideration for our own time. We set boundaries around our personal space, our time together as a couple, and our needs. It was uncomfortable, and it felt like we were walking a tightrope at times. But with each firm boundary we set, I felt a little lighter, a little more like myself. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was losing myself in someone else's control. I wasn't allowing myself to be manipulated anymore, not by her, and not by my own fears of confrontation. I could feel the strength returning to me, the power to make my own decisions, to assert my own needs without feeling guilty. And while my relationship with my mother-in-law was still fraught with tension, there was also a glimmer of hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We were creating a new dynamic, one where I didn't have to shrink myself to fit into her narrative. We were learning to coexist, find a middle ground, to protect the most important thing, our marriage. The process was long and difficult, and there were moments when I wanted to give up, when I felt like the weight of it all might crush me. But I realized that growth never comes from comfort. It comes from confrontation, from setting boundaries, from refusing to let anyone take away your peace of mind. I had spent so many years allowing the manipulation to erode me, but I was no longer that person. I was stronger now, more confident in who I was, and more determined to protect the love I shared with my husband. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about me, about us. And no matter how hard it got, I was willing to fight for our future. As time passed, the new boundaries began to take shape, but the road wasn't without its bumps. The more I stood firm in my decisions, the more I could see my mother-in-law's resistance. It was subtle at first, small jabs, hidden under the guise of concern, a comment here, a glance there. She would push just enough to test the limits, to see if we were truly serious about the changes we were making. And it wasn't just her passive-aggressive comments that were hard to navigate. It was the emotional pull of family ties, the guilt trips, the expectations that this was all temporary and that she'd somehow win in the end. But I wasn't backing down this time. Neither was my husband. It became clearer that, despite the guilt she tried to place on us, it was necessary for us to protect our relationship from her constant interference. She was used to being the center of attention, the one whose needs and desires were prioritized. And now, she had to adjust to the reality that we were no longer allowing her to dictate the terms of our lives. We had moments of tension, moments when I thought we might not make it through. There were times when my husband struggled, torn between the woman he had grown up with and the wife he wanted to protect. He loved both of us, but it wasn't fair for him to feel like he had to choose. I could see the anguish in his eyes, the internal battle that raged within him as he navigated this complex situation. It wasn't just about my relationship with his mother, it was about his role as a husband, and his duty to stand by me. Despite the progress we made in setting boundaries, there were still moments when I questioned everything. The guilt I had been feeling for years, guilt for not being able to please his mother, guilt for wanting a life without her looming over us, would creep up when I least expected it. It wasn't just the manipulation I resented. It was the constant emotional toll it took on my self-esteem, my sense of self-worth. I had spent so many years believing that in order to be loved, I had to conform to everyone else's expectations. Now, I was learning that love didn't require me to shrink myself. I didn't have to be a martyr for the sake of keeping the peace. Still, it wasn't easy. Some days I would find myself slipping back into old habits, apologizing when I shouldn't, making excuses for her behavior. But each time I did, I would stop myself and remind myself of how far I had come. I had to give myself credit for the strength it took to break free from the cycle of manipulation, for the courage it took to stand up for myself, for the patience I was learning to give myself. And then there were the moments when I realized the change was real. When I saw my husband's efforts to stand up for me and to set boundaries with his mother. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about us. He had learned that in order to protect our marriage, he had to stop playing the role of mediator between us. It wasn't easy for him, but he was willing to make the sacrifices necessary for our peace. The real breakthrough came when he began to assert himself in ways I had never seen before. When his mother attempted to guilt him, to push his buttons, he would firmly let her know that things had changed. He would stand by me, by our decisions, even when it felt uncomfortable. And with each stand he took, it became clear that he wasn't just doing it for me, he was doing it for us. We were no longer two individuals trying to coexist with a force that threatened to tear us apart. We were a team, united in our desire for peace, for freedom from the emotional manipulations of his mother. There were still moments when my mother-in-law would test us, when her passive-aggressive tactics would rise to the surface, but each time, we faced it together. We learned how to support each other, how to communicate our feelings without guilt or shame, how to navigate the complexities of family dynamics without letting it poison our bond. The process wasn't easy, and there were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if things would ever truly change. But over time, as we set those boundaries and consistently enforced them, the atmosphere in our home began to shift. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual one. My mother-in-law stopped showing up uninvited, and when she did visit, the dynamic felt different. It was more respectful, more balanced. There was a quiet understanding that things had shifted, and that I wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how close they were to my husband, violate the peace we had worked so hard to create. Looking back, I realized that the hardest part wasn't standing up to her, it was standing up for myself. It was realizing that I had the right to protect my peace, to not let the manipulation and passive-aggressive behavior define my reality. In choosing to protect myself, I had chosen to protect us. While the road wasn't easy, it was worth it. We had learned to prioritize each other over external pressures, to stand firm in our love without being swayed by anyone's toxic influence. And in doing so, we had learned to build a life that was ours, one based on mutual respect, communication, and love. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.